In the glittering world of ancient Rome, behind the marble columns and golden palaces, there existed a dark reality that history has often chosen to forget. While we celebrate Rome's military conquests, architectural marvels, and legal innovations, we rarely speak of those who paid the highest price to maintain this splendor. Young men forced into lives of servitude as male concubines to the wealthy and powerful. These weren't just servants or slaves performing household duties. They were human beings trapped in a system designed to exploit their youth, beauty, and vulnerability for the pleasure of Rome's elite. Their stories reveal a side of the Roman Empire that challenges our romanticized view of this ancient civilization, exposing the brutal reality of what it meant to be powerless in a world where might made right. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Then please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Roman Empire's relationship with intimate companionship was vastly different from modern understanding. Where we might see clear boundaries between consent and coercion, Romans saw a complex hierarchy where power determined everything. At the bottom of this hierarchy were young men, often taken from conquered territories or born into slavery, who found themselves thrust into roles they never chose. These young men, some barely teenagers, were selected not for their skills or intelligence, but for their physical appearance and perceived ability to provide entertainment for their masters. They lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing when they might be summoned, what would be expected of them, or how their refusal or compliance might affect their survival. The selection process itself was dehumanizing. Wealthy Romans would visit slave markets much like modern people might visit a livestock auction, examining potential purchases for their physical attributes, age, and origin. Young men from Greece were particularly praised for their supposed refinement and education, while those from Germanic tribes were valued for their fair complexion and robust build. The buyers showed no consideration for the terror these young men must have felt, standing exposed and vulnerable, while strangers debated their worth. Once purchased, these concubines entered households where their lives were no longer their own. They were expected to be available at all hours, to anticipate their master's needs before being asked, and to maintain an appearance of willing participation regardless of their true feelings. The psychological toll of this existence cannot be overstated. Imagine being forced to smile and appear grateful while enduring treatment that violated every aspect of your dignity and autonomy. The daily routine of a male concubine varied depending on their master's preferences and social status. Some were kept in luxurious quarters, dressed in fine clothes, and given access to education and cultural activities, but always with the understanding that these privileges came at a price. Others lived in conditions barely better than common slaves, called upon only when their master desired their company, then dismissed back to quarters where they had no privacy, no personal possessions, and no hope of escape. What made their situation particularly tragic was the complete lack of legal protection or recourse. While Roman law provided some protections for citizens and even certain rights for slaves, male concubines occupied a gray area where their master's desires took precedence over any consideration of their well-being. They couldn't seek help from the authorities, couldn't form meaningful relationships with others, couldn't even express their suffering without risking punishment. The psychological manipulation these young men endured was perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects of their servitude. Masters often employed techniques designed to break down their resistance and create dependency. Some concubines were given special privileges or shown temporary kindness, only to have these gifts withdrawn as punishment for perceived slights. This created a constant state of anxiety and confusion, as they never knew whether they were in favor or facing punishment. Many masters deliberately isolated their concubines from other household members, preventing them from forming friendships or alliances that might provide emotional support. This isolation was particularly cruel for young men who had been torn from their families and communities, as it prevented them from maintaining any connection to their former identities or cultures. The competitive nature of some households added another layer of psychological torture. When masters kept multiple concubines, they often pitted them against each other for attention and privileges. This prevented solidarity among the victims and created an atmosphere of constant tension and betrayal. Young men who might have found comfort in shared experiences instead found themselves competing for their master's favor, knowing that falling out of favor could mean facing even worse treatment. The education provided to some concubines was itself a form of control. While learning to read, write, and engage in philosophical discussions might seem like opportunities, these skills were taught primarily to make the concubines more entertaining companions. They were expected to be able to discuss literature and politics, but only in ways that pleased their masters. Their education was another tool used to shape them into more perfect objects for their owner's enjoyment. Physical appearance was maintained through strict regimens that concubines had no choice but to follow. They were required to exercise regularly, maintain specific diets, and undergo grooming practices that kept them looking youthful and attractive. Some were even given cosmetic treatments or surgeries to alter their appearance according to their master's preferences. These procedures were performed without modern medical knowledge or pain management, making them both dangerous and excruciating. The clothing and jewelry worn by concubines served as both ornaments and symbols of ownership. Masters often took pride in how beautifully they could dress their companions, treating them like living dolls rather than human beings. The irony was that while concubines might be draped in silk and gold, they were completely powerless under all that beauty and luxury. Travel might sound like a nice part of their lives, but it was just another way to control them. Some concubines had to go with their masters to other cities or provinces, but they never had a choice. They were like portable property, expected to do the same things no matter where they went, and had to adjust to new places and people without complaining. The way Roman households worked made things even harder for male concubines. Even if they lived in luxury, they had no real status in the home. Other slaves often looked down on them, thinking their role was shameful, and the free people in the house treated them like temporary toys, not like real people who deserved respect or kindness. The families they left behind also suffered. When young men were taken as concubines, their families usually never found out what happened to them. Parents might spend years not knowing if their sons were alive or dead, not realizing they were trapped in situations where escape was almost impossible. This was even more heartbreaking in cultures where family meant everything and community was keys to survival. Some concubines ended up in this life because of debt slavery. When families were going broke, they sometimes had to give up their sons to pay what they owed. It was an impossible decision, either watch all their children starve or give up one son to save the rest. This was heartbreaking for both the families and the boys because everyone knew exactly what kind of sacrifice was being made. The few stories we have of concubines trying to run away show how desperate they were. They took huge risks just for a tiny chance to be free. If they were caught, the punishments were harsh and very public, meant to scare others from trying the same thing.
These punishments weren't just painful, they were meant to shame. Masters wanted to show everyone that they had full control over their property. Some concubines tried to escape by ending their own lives, but even that wasn't allowed. Masters spent a lot of money on them and didn't want to lose their investment, so they made sure the boys were always watched and removed anything that could be used for self-harm. Religion didn't help them either. Even though Romans prayed to gods of protection and justice, those blessings didn't seem to include male concubines. Some boys found comfort in foreign religions or secret cults, but they had to worship in secret too. Their masters controlled everything, even what they believed. Because concubines were seen as valuable property, a market grew around them. Rich Romans competed to get the most beautiful or talented boys. This pushed prices higher and gave traders more reason to keep bringing in new victims. Human lives became nothing more than money calculations. There were even special schools that trained boys to be concubines, just like gladiator schools trained fighters. These places were brutal and made a lot of money, breaking the boys down mentally and physically while teaching them how to act for their future masters. The training wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. They were taught how to be obedient and attractive. Some of them were just kids when this started, and growing up like that did serious damage. They never got to have normal relationships, chase their own interests, or even understand what real love and connection were like. Different parts of the Roman Empire treated concubines a little differently, depending on the local culture, but none of them treated the boys with real dignity or respect. Some areas were a bit less cruel, others were worse, but no matter where they were, the lack of freedom was always the same. Growing older brought more pain. Unlike some other slaves who might earn or buy their freedom, concubines who lost their beauty were often tossed aside. Some were sold to worse households. Others were just abandoned, left with no skills or money to survive on their own. The few who managed to escape that life and build a new future were extremely rare. They had to start over completely, hide their past, and deal with the emotional scars from everything they'd been through. Their stories are inspiring, but they're only inspiring because they were so unusual. Even the medical care concubines got wasn't about kindness, it was just to keep them looking good and working properly. Masters wanted to protect their investment, so they gave medical help only when it kept the boys healthy and attractive. No one cared about their mental health or the long-term effects. The fact that this whole system was accepted by the Roman upper class says a lot about their morals. Romans liked to talk about honor, duty, and virtue, but those ideas only mattered if you were a free citizen from the right class. Concubines didn't count. Their suffering didn't matter. They weren't even seen as people. Some concubines did learn how to survive. They got really good at reading their master's mood, figuring out what they wanted, and handling the tricky politics of the household. These skills helped them avoid punishment, but they also turned them into performers. They had to fake happiness all the time just to stay safe.
They had to show gratitude all the time, even while hiding how they really felt. The seasons in Roman social life also affected what concubines went through. During big festivals and parties, they had to take part in fancy performances. In quieter times, they got a small break from all the attention, but even then, they were always nervous about when they might be called again. They weren't allowed to talk freely with other concubines or slaves, but when they could, they created their own secret ways to support each other and share information. They used small gestures and hidden signs to warn about their master's moods or to comfort each other when things were really bad. These hidden friendships gave them emotional strength in a life that was otherwise so lonely. This whole system didn't just hurt the concubines, it also shaped Roman society. Treating people like objects for pleasure became normal, and that made it easier for Romans to accept other kinds of cruelty, like gladiator fights or crushing slave revolts. Archaeologists have found little clues about their lives. Objects in rich Roman homes that were probably used to control concubines, or personal things that show how they lived. But most of the proof is gone now, just like their voices were ignored back then.
In Roman writings, male concubines were mentioned briefly and very vaguely. Writers didn't want to talk about the disturbing parts. But if you read between the lines, you can tell these were lives full of suffering and no power. Being sold to a new master was one of the worst times for concubines. They didn't know what to expect. Would their new owner be cruel or kind? Every time they moved, they had to start over and learn how to survive all over again. Some masters got bored of them quickly and sold them off or made them regular house slaves. Others kept them for a long time, and even though that made things a bit more stable, it was still based on using them. Either way, their whole future depended completely on what their master wanted. Rich Romans often moved between their city homes and country villas, and they took their concubines with them. That meant the boys had to keep adjusting to new places, new people, and new expectations. They could never settle down or feel safe anywhere. Concubines were taught music, poetry, and conversation, which sounds fancy, but it was actually really sad. They were trained to love art and culture, but never allowed to make or share anything for themselves. All their learning was just to entertain others, not for their own joy. The physical training they had to go through was hard. They were forced to stay in shape, follow strict diets, and even go through body changes, all to stay attractive to their masters. They had no choice, no matter how painful or harmful it was. During Roman festivals, they had even more pressure. They were expected to perform and entertain during private parties. These events might look like fun from the outside, but for concubines, they were just more chances to be embarrassed and used. Making friends in the house was also hard. Even if they lived in a nice place, everyone knew they were only treated well because the master liked them. So real friendships or love were almost impossible. The trade routes that brought young boys to Rome stretched across the whole Mediterranean and beyond. This system encouraged war, kidnappings, and families selling their sons into slavery just to survive. It hurt not just the boys, but entire communities and cultures. Training these boys wasn't just about teaching them tricks, it was about breaking them mentally. Masters and their helpers knew exactly how to find a boy's weak points and use them. Today, we'd call this emotional abuse. The clothes and jewelry concubines wore weren't just for looks. They showed their status, proved their master's wealth, and reminded everyone, including the boys themselves, that they didn't own their own bodies. The medical treatments and grooming they were forced into were often painful, risky, and sometimes left permanent damage. No one asked them if they were okay with it. Their bodies were changed to fit what their masters wanted. Growing up this way messed them up deeply. They never got to learn about healthy relationships, boundaries, or consent. Even if they were freed one day, healing from all that was almost impossible. Many of them were kept away from other people on purpose. Masters didn't want them making friends or finding help. This loneliness meant they didn't learn the social skills or build the connections that could have helped them escape or survive. And this isolation wasn't an accident. It was part of the control. Putting a price tag on concubines turned human lives into numbers, with their value changing based on things like age, looks, skills, and where they came from. This way of thinking made it easier for their masters to treat them like objects they could throw away, instead of people who deserved basic respect and dignity. This kind of thinking didn't just hurt the boys, it shaped all of Roman society. When a culture is okay with hurting young, vulnerable people like this, it becomes easier to accept other kinds of cruelty and unfairness too. That's how Rome became a place where oppression was just a part of everyday life. Even though very few tried to fight back, the small acts of rebellion by concubines showed how strong the human spirit can be. They may have failed or been punished, but they still tried to show they were more than property. Rome had all these big ideas about religion and philosophy, but none of it helped these boys. People talked about ethics and morals, yet somehow didn't see a problem with using powerless young men like this. The seasons in Rome also played a part. Certain times of year were always worse, with more pressure, more work, and more demands. Even when things were quiet, concubines knew the busy season was coming soon. The families and villages where these boys came from were also torn apart. Losing them wasn't just hard for their parents, it shook entire communities.
It was part of the larger damage caused by Rome's hunger for more land, more people, and more control. The way they trained these boys was carefully planned and deeply harmful. Their minds were broken down slowly, generation after generation, with methods that worked well for their masters but destroyed the boys inside. Roman law didn't help them either. Legally, they weren't seen as people, just property. That made it easy for society to ignore their suffering, because in the law's eyes, they didn't really exist. Since the slave trade was so profitable, there was always a reason to keep it going. Buying and selling human beings became normal, and no one was willing to stop it because the money was too good. All the physical training and emotional manipulation was meant to make perfect, obedient companions. But the cost was massive. They lost their sense of self, their dignity, and their ability to feel like real human beings. Even if they got their freedom later, many could never recover. When we think back on their stories, we have to remember these weren't just random names or numbers in a book. These were real people with dreams, fears, and hopes that were crushed. The concubines of ancient Rome weren't just small side notes in history. Their lives tell us deep truths about power, abuse, and human strength. Their stories remind us to look past the fancy buildings and gold of ancient Rome and see what that beauty was built on. They show us that all that glory came at a terrible price, paid by the people who had no choice. The way Rome turned this kind of abuse into a system shows how easily people can accept cruelty if it helps the rich and powerful stay in charge. Even while writing big books on law and philosophy, the Romans ran a huge network of human trafficking, showing how people can twist morality to protect their power. And even in the middle of all that horror, some of these boys still found tiny ways to survive. They held on to bits of dignity, found small connections with others, and did whatever they could to keep going. Those little acts of strength are proof of how powerful the human spirit really is. When we understand their stories, it helps us see the same patterns today. The world looks different now, but the basic problem, people with power using others for their own gain, still exists. These boys' stories are warnings. They show us what happens when a society allows the rich to treat people like objects. The reason we don't talk about these things much is because it makes us uncomfortable. But if we bring these stories back into the light, we honor the people who suffered and remind ourselves that we must never let this happen again. These boys lived and died in ways no one ever should. Their stories shouldn't be told as shocking trivia. They should be remembered as powerful proof of how much people can endure and how much we must fight to stop it from happening again. When we remember them, we admit they were human, and we promise to build a world where no one else has to suffer like they did. Their legacy makes us ask hard questions about how we treat vulnerable people today, and what future generations might say about the injustices we ignore now. The things they went through still matter, and in the end, the awful life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire is a clear reminder that even the biggest empires are often built on pain. By facing that truth honestly, we can respect those who suffered and work to make sure their pain never becomes the cost of someone else's comfort again.